So let me go into VS Code here, and in advance, during break, I went ahead and created the beginnings of a login-based application. If I type ls in my login directory here, we'll see app.py, requirements.txt, and a templates directory, inside of which, as before, is just index.html and layout.html. But let's go ahead and implement a website that now knows if I'm logged in or not, albeit simplistically. Let me go ahead and open up my index template in templates. And I'll close my terminal window. And in here, I'm going to use some Jinja syntax that we've seen before. If the current user has a name, well, then they're clearly logged in. So let's go ahead and say you are logged in as name, period. And if it's not the case that there's a name value, then let's go ahead and say you are not logged in, period. And I'm going to add an end if down here. So at the moment, I'm just assuming that name is a thing and that it actually exists, but I'm going to need to implement now that logic next. So let me go into my terminal window again, this time opening up my app.py, which isn't really doing much yet, and start to make a few changes. In addition to importing Flask and render template and request, I'm also going to import a feature called session. And then down here, I'm going to configure Flask to use sessions as follows. And this is the kind of thing you can copy paste from documentation or these here examples. But I'm going to say app.config, quote unquote, session permanent equals false, capital F for false in Python, and app.config, quote unquote, session type equals, quote unquote, file system in lowercase. This essentially enables the ability to store sessions. Put another way, this turns cookies on for this web application. It ensures that the cookies are not permanent in the sense that what cookies I'm using should disappear when the user quits their browser, ultimately. But I'm using on the server the file system, like the files and folders locally, to keep track of who is logged in. And then lastly, I'm going to say session, capital S, and specify app there too. And I'm going to import one other line that I forgot from Flask session, import session, capital S. Again, there's some hoops to jump through here. I too have to check the documentation or my own examples to remember what. But in short, I'm importing Flask's support for sessions. I'm importing this session-specific library as well. I'm specifying these configuration options, and I'm now turning on sessions with this final line of code. Of course, for this to work, I actually need another requirement. So let me open up requirements.txt, which up until now we've not needed because we already put Flask in there. But I actually now want to use the Flask session library as well. Strictly speaking, you don't need to do this in cs50.dev because we've pre-installed it. But for a typical real-world application, we would need to tell the server that we indeed have another library and install it with pip. All right. So that's mostly copy-pastable boilerplate. Let's go ahead now and implement a route. So app.route, quote unquote, slash, for my default route, define a function called index, as before. And let's very simply return render template, quote unquote, index.html. And then that is it for now. Let me hide my terminal. Go back to my other browser tab, which still shows the previous application, frosh.ims. But so long as I run Flask run in this tab here, and go back to that tab and click reload, I should now see this new application. And indeed I do. It just says you are not logged in because I haven't done anything related to logging in yet. Well, that's OK. How do I want to go about implementing this then instead? Well, let me propose that if we want the user to be able to log in, we need a form via which they can tell us who they are. So let me go back to VS Code. I'm going to go back to my second terminal window here, and I'm going to cd into my login folder to be in the same place, into my templates folder to be in that place, and I'm going to create one more template called login.html. Inside of login.html, I'm going to very carefully type extends, quote unquote, layout.html, close quote, %. Down here, I'm going to say block body as always, and then end block down here. And then in here, I'm going to whip up a very simple form. So form action equals quote unquote /login. The idea being, in a moment, I will create a new login form. The method I'm going to use for logging in, for privacy's sake, is going to be quote unquote post. Then inside of this form, I'm going to have a text field where autocomplete is off, also for privacy's sake. Autofocus is on for convenience's sake. The name of this field is name for the user's name. The placeholder they'll see is quote unquote name. And the type of this field, to be clear, is text. For simplicity's sake, I'm not going to bother with a password. In fact, we'll see that in the next problem set. But for now, I'm just going to allow the user to log in just by telling us their name and no password. So I'm going to have a button, the type of which is submit, and then the label for that button shall be log in. How now do I actually render this template so that the user sees it when it's time to log in? Well, I think this is fairly straightforward. If I go back to app.py, I can create another route down here, app.route, quote unquote, /login. Then I can create a function called, for instance, login to keep it simple. And then I can simply do render template, quote unquote, login.html. Now I could go manually to /login to access that page, but let's make this template a little more user-friendly that we began with. Let's actually give the user a link, ahref equals, quote unquote, /login, and then inside of that anchor tag, login, period. Otherwise, let's proactively do this, ahref, quote unquote, log out, and then inside of that anchor tag, log out. That is backwards. So let's do it correctly this time. Here, we're going to say log out if the user is logged in. Down here, we're going to say log in if the user is logged out. So I think now it's consistent with the English I already had earlier. Let's go back to the original URL, whereby it says you are not logged in, but it now gives me a link to log in. If I hover over that, super tiny, but in the bottom of my screen, I will see that it's going to the /login route. And indeed, if I click on that, I find myself at the first, well, the 10th of many errors today. So let's go back into VS Code. Let's open up my terminal window, click on the one that's running Flask, and the view function for login did not return a valid response. The function either returned none or ended without a return statement. So user error on my part. Let's scroll down, and sure enough, I did something dumb. I need to return the return value of render template. All right, let's hide that. Let's go back. Let's click reload, enter, and now we see the login form. Of course, it doesn't do anything useful. If I type in David and click login, it goes to the login route, but it's saying method not allowed because I haven't done anything yet with post. That's fine too. Let's go back to my login route, and let's do this. If the requests method equals post, the implication being the human clicked the login button after typing in their name, then let's do this. Session, then in square brackets, name equals request.form.get, quote unquote, name. And then we will, let's say, return redirect, quote unquote, /. So what's going on here? If the user indeed submitted the login form using a request method of post, which is implicit because that is the method I'm using in login.html, thereby allowing me to distinguish between whether the user just visited the form or they submitted the form. If I go back to app.py, I am, in the case of submitting the form, going to store in a special global variable, which I imported up here on line 1, a key called name, and I'm going to set the value of that key equal to whatever the human's name actually is. Now, as an aside, I'm not bothering with error checking now, so it's possible to just click the button and not type in a name. But imagine from Frosh IMs, we could borrow some of that if not logic to make sure that the human gave us a valid name. But the point here is that this special global variable that I've now imported and enabled by way of these lines of code here is essentially giving me a global variable that's in its essence a global dictionary in which I can store any key value pairs. The first key I'm storing is name. The first value I'm storing is the human's actual name. And what I can now do, more interestingly, is this. When it comes to displaying the default page, which recall is index.html, recall that I was checking, is there a name being passed in? Well, there can be. Instead of just rendering the template index.html, let's pass in the user's actual name by using session.get, quote unquote, name. And here too, I'm using a feature of this session global variable whereby it too, like request.args and request.form, comes with a get method built in that allows me to get the value of that specific key. And as an aside, if there is no such value, it will at least return none, capital N in Python, which is similar in spirit to null, but unrelated to memory. But it's a special value that indicates, there was no such name. But so long as I'm using this logic in index.html, checking if there is a name, that's either going to be a valid name or blank or missing. In either case, I will display the user's name, I think. So if I've done everything correct here, which I haven't, but I caught myself this time, I did one last thing on line 20. If the user has submitted the form via post, and per line 19, I've remembered in my session that they're logged in. That's sort of equivalent to stamping their hand, storing their name in the session, effectively remembering who they are. The last thing I'm going to do is redirect the user back to /. Why? Well, think about most any website you log into. If you try to visit a page and you're not logged in, you log in, hit enter, and you're usually redirected back to like the home page or the default page. How can you do that? Well, / represents the default home page, so I just need to import one more feature of Flask, the redirect function. So I'm going to add that to my comma-separated list on line 1, and that gives me the ability to send, if you recall from last week, one of those 301 status codes, or 300 something, that tells the browser that the website has moved to this other location, for instance, from this to this other one. All right, let me go back now to the browser here. Let me click back to the main page such that I'm told you are not logged in. Let me click on login. Let me type in my name, crossing my fingers, enter, and now, oh, darn it, I'm still getting method not allowed. But this is something we've seen before. That's just because I'm trying to use the login route for both get and post. So I think I need to add methods equals quote unquote get and quote unquote post, just as with Frosh IMs. And now if I go back and I try to resubmit this form and click continue, now you are logged in as David, period. There's still a bug, or really a missing feature. If I click log out, I go to /logout, which is not found at all, but that's just because that route doesn't exist. That's fine. Let me go back to VS Code here. Let me create one final route, app.route, quote unquote, /logout. And then in this route, let's define a function called logout to keep it simple. And in here, I just need to clear the session. I need to clear off the hand stamp from the user so as to tell them, stop sending me this cookie. And so we can actually do a function called session.clear, which clears the contents of the session. And then I can go ahead and return, redirect, quote unquote, / so that once you log out, you're just sent back to the home page again. So if I try this again over here, 404, let me go back to where I was. Let me click log out now. And notice I'm still at /, but I'm no longer logged in. I can do it again all day long. Type in David, log in, click log out. I can log in now as Yulia, log in, now she is logged in, and now she's logged out. And even though I keep saying /, recall that browsers are typically just in the habit of hiding values that don't really need to be there all the time. So if you see nothing after the TLD in the URL, it's implied that you're visiting /, the default page. All right. So with that said, what we've just introduced then is this idea of a session whereby, because of how HTTP works and because of how cookies can be sent back and forth from browsers and servers, and because Flask is used by so many people, they've implemented all of the functionality for us to keep track of those cookies and reading them and figuring out who is who. What's nice about the session global variable is that you can implement one web application, and if you want to store something in memory for a specific user, you can store it in the session dictionary instead of in a global variable, instead of in a database. So if you want to keep track of who is logged in on a per browser basis, you use session. If by contrast you were to use a global variable like registrants, like we did a little bit ago, every user of your website would have access to that memory, which you don't want. So session is sort of like a per user variable, and you don't have to know or care how it's implemented, but being in CS50, you know now that that session abstraction, that per user global variable, is really implemented under the hood because Flask is opening that virtual envelope looking for the set cookie and the cookie headers back and forth and taking care of all of that to ensure that you can just use session as we intended on a per user basis. All right, so let's go ahead and implement another application that also implements a very common feature using sessions, but this time to implement full-fledged shopping carts. For instance, if you want to implement a bookstore online via which people can add books to their shopping cart. Well, let's see where to begin. In advance, I've created this folder called store, and inside of it, I've got a few files: app.py, requirements.txt, store.db, which is new, and templates. And inside of templates is the usual index.html and layout.html. Let me go ahead and use SQLite to open store.db. Let me go ahead and maximize my terminal window and simply do a .schema to see what's inside here. Seems that there's a single table in store.db called books that has two columns. One is an ID, which will be a unique identifier, aka primary key, the other of which is title. If I want to select star from books, I can see all of them, and in this database there's only 5, sort of 5 of my favorite books, if you will. All right, so now that we know that we have that database, can we go about implementing our own version of Amazon, if you will, our own shopping cart to buy these books? Let's go ahead and open up requirements.txt, and as before, let's also include as a dependency flask-session, even though it's already installed on the server. But if you use this application anywhere else, you'll need to install that too via pip. Now let's go ahead and open up app.py, close my terminal, and let's add some of those same features up here. Let's import as well redirect, as well as request, as well as session. Let's, above that, go ahead and import from CS50 the SQL feature, as we've used earlier. And let's also import from Flask Session the feature called Session, capital S. Then down here, let's proactively connect to the database with the SQL function specifying SQLite : //store.db. Let's then configure sessions as before with app.config, quote unquote, session_permanent equals false. Then let's specify app.config, quote unquote, session type equals, quote unquote, file system, all lowercase. And then lastly, to enable sessions, session passing in app, essentially wrapping the web application with this session functionality. Now let's do something simple, a very simple template that just spits out all of the books. So let's define a route for /. The function therein shall be called index as before. Inside of that function, let's do this. Create a variable called books, set it equal to db.execute, quote unquote, select star from books to keep it simple. And then let's return render template, passing in the template books.html, which I'll create momentarily, and passing in those books as we've done many times now with a key and a value as a named parameter. OK, let me open my terminal. Let me open up a file in templates called books.html. So that I can create now this template. And this one will be relatively short, but dynamic in that we're going to do the following. Let's extend layout.html as we keep doing. Let us then define a block called body as always. End the block down here. And inside of this block, let's do this. How about a nice big H1 that says books to list what's in the catalog? Then let's do this. For each book in the books parameter that was passed into this template, and proactively, I'll do N4 down here. Let's go ahead and output, how about each of the book's titles? So how might I do this? Well, let's go ahead and maybe start like we did earlier with a UL tag down over here. And inside of this, let's do a bunch of LIs, where inside of the LI, I'm going to go ahead and do the books.title to spit out its title. All right. Now I'm going to go back to my terminal window, and as before, I'm going to do Flask run, having previously stopped the other instance of Flask in my other tab. Enter. And now I'm going to go ahead and open up the application as always. And when I hit reload, we should see no longer our login application, but store. And sure enough, there is a very simple, if unuseful, bookstore that just lists all of the titles therein. All right, well, let's make this more interesting now. Let's actually enable the user to add things to their cart. We can do the user interface in a bunch of different ways, but let me propose that we do this. Instead of a UL tag, let's do an actual form. So let's actually do, how about this? For each book in books, let's go ahead and output an actual usable form for every book. Even though this is not necessarily the only way to do it, it's perhaps the simplest to start with. For this book, let's go ahead and output an H2 tag with its title. So book.title. And then down here, let's do a form for this book. Form action equals, quote unquote, cart, which I'll claim is a route we'll implement in a moment. The method I want to use for privacy's sake is going to be post. for this form. Now I'm going to go ahead and include a button whose type is submit, and the value of that button is going to be add to cart. And now I need to actually specify what I want to send to the server so that it knows what book to add to the cart. So I can do this, for instance, input name equals title of the book, the value of which is quote unquote the book's title as before. And the type of this box could be text. Now, let me go over to the store tab again. Let me hit reload. And if I haven't messed up, I think I should, if ugly, have for each book an input that shows its title and a button that will allow me to submit that title to the server. Now this is silly because I already have the book's title here, and it certainly shouldn't be the case that I can change the title of a book to add it to my cart, so I don't think I want an input of type text. So there's another way I can do this. I can actually make those inputs hidden by changing the input's type from text to hidden. Now, if I go back to that tab and click reload, I still have the buttons, and underneath the hood, I still have the book's titles, such that when I click add to cart, the book's title will be sent to the server. But this too is a little sloppy because recall that the database that we're using, if I cd in my other tab into the bookstore and do SQLite of store.db and do select star from books, recall that I have for each book not only a title, but also a unique identifier. And this is good because even though this database is small, what if two books have the same title? That's definitely the case in the real world, but they might have different authors, and they definitely have different IDs. So much better practice than sending a string of text is to use what we learned in our week on SQL, use the primary key to uniquely identify these books. And so by this I mean, let's change our template here to pass in not a hidden title, but a hidden ID, so that what's actually going to be submitted is the number 1 or 2 or 3 on up. So if now I go back to that other tab and reload, visually nothing has changed, but notice if I right click or control click, view page source, I indeed have a bunch of forms on this page, but notice this form will submit value 1 to the server. This form will submit value 2. This form will submit value 3. This is exactly how websites like Amazon and the like work, such that when you click add to cart, your browser is sending a unique identifier for that book or whatever it is to the server. And the server is then saving that ID in its database or its session or somewhere else to remember what book or item is in your cart. So we too can do that. Let me go back to VS Code and let me go into app.py and let's add a bit more logic that's going to allow me to add those numbers to my cart. Well, what is the cart going to be? Well, we have to implement a route for this. So let's define app.route, quote unquote, /cart. And then down here, let's define a function called cart. And then in here, let's do a couple of things. Let's first say if request.method equals post, the implication of which is the user clicked a button to submit a form. Then let's go ahead and get the ID from that form. I'm going to get request.form.get quote unquote ID. Now, just to keep myself sane, I'm going to call it book_ID, just so I know it's a book's ID and not some other identifier here in Python. As always, I'm going to do some error checking. If the book ID exists, then I'm going to add that book ID to the shopping cart in my session by appending it to that cart. Now, what's going on here? I'm assuming at the moment that there's already a shopping cart in my session. What is the type of that cart? Well, because I'm using append, which we have used in the past, it's a method that allows you to append a value to a list of items. Turns out, I'm assuming at the moment that my shopping cart underneath the hood is implemented as a simple Python list. But to do that, I need to make sure it exists. I don't want this to be some global variable. I just need in my route to check that the cart exists for this person. So what I'm going to do is this. If the cart key does not exist in this user's session, then let's go ahead and create a shopping cart for this user in their session that equals an empty list. And again, you can think of a session as a global variable for this specific user. And it's Flask that handles all the cookie stuff to make sure that abstraction works. But the very first time someone accesses your shopping cart and tries to put something in it, it literally won't exist because the session itself is completely empty. But I can put a key in there, the value of which is an empty list, and then subsequently I can add anything I want to that list, just as I'm doing with this append function down here. Once now something has been added to the shopping cart, let's return the user by redirecting them to their shopping cart. Otherwise, if the request method is not post and it's get, which is to say the user just visited the cart, let's show them the contents of their cart. Let's create a variable called books, set it equal to db.execute, quote unquote, select star from books, where, and here's where we can use more SQL skills, the ID of the book is in this list of IDs, using a placeholder and parentheses to make clear in SQL that I want to check if it's in a list of values, much like we talked about nested queries in week 7. But what list of values do I want to pass in? Well, that's easy. Session, quote unquote, cart. Pass in the list that I've called cart to which I've been appending all of these IDs. And once I have those books, and recall that dbExecute returns a list of dictionaries, I can return render template of quote unquote cart.html, passing in those books as the value of that named parameter. And so if I now want to actually see what is in that cart, we need just one more template. So let me open my terminal window. Let me exit out of SQLite. Let me go into my templates folder and create a cart.html template. Hide my terminal window, extends layout.html, close quote, and %, then block body as always, then down here, end block as always, and then in here, let's do something super simple. H1 for cart, to make clear this is your shopping cart and not the catalog of books. Let's do an ordered list, just so we can see the order in which things were sorted. And now we'll do for book in books, and inside of this Jinja for loop and for, let's go ahead and specify a list item of that book's title. And again, you can use different syntax in Jinja. You can do book.title, or you can do book quote unquote title, indexing into it in that way. But I'll use slightly simpler syntax as we've been doing for a while. All right. If I've now made no mistakes, which is low probability, let's reload the application itself. The cart, we now see the same catalog of books. Let me proactively go to /cart in my URL up top and hit enter, and you'll see that my cart is empty at the moment. But because of all of the logic I've added to my cart route, watch what happens if we add these to the cart. Let's try adding the very first book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Click. All right, I screwed up here. I did get redirected to cart, but that method is not allowed. We know I'm using post, because that is what was in my form, but I think this is an easy fix. If I'm using method equals post here, I need to support that route here, so I need to specify the methods I want to support are indeed not just get, but also post for my cart route. All right, let's go back again, back to the catalog, and click Add to Cart. Aha! Not only has it been added to the session, I've been redirected to /cart, and because it's in my session, there is the first book. Let me hit back now. Let's add the last book to the cart, mostly harmless. Click. And now I have those two books in my cart. Now, to be clear, these are only stored in the session. They're not yet stored in a database, so this isn't like the user has placed an order. It's more like they have added something indeed to their shopping cart temporarily. And in fact, you can kind of see what's been going on all this time as follows. If I cd back to my store directory, and let me clear the terminal, and type ls, notice this other folder magically appeared called Flask Session. And in fact, if I look inside of Flask Session, you'll see it turns out a couple of files now. Because I've been using this for some time, I've created 2 sessions over time, and I essentially have 2 cookie values stored in this folder that's keeping track of what the user has been doing on my website. In short, these files that are stored temporarily in that folder are the result of having configured the session as follows: to use a file system-based session so that Flask is creating these files for you and storing in those files as much information as it needs to remember what is in whose cart. And it uses cookies ultimately